In chapter 23, we read about the issuing and trading of securities, which are two of the most strongly regulated aspects of corporate business. There is a tremendous amount of information in both of the chapters that we read this week. I find it to be not only a lot of information, but somewhat confusing. Um, I think that it's very important as a person in business that if you are involved in the type of business that involves securities or the potential for antitrust situations, that you definitely are knowledgeable in these areas and have and employ people who are knowledgeable in these areas, because certainly as we have read over the past semester and in various other courses that I have studied, these are certainly areas of great concern and liability as far as a business and individually. So it's very important that there be a clear understanding that of these various aspects and that things are done in accordance with laws and regulations. We're introduced in chapter 23 to a number of acts that have been implemented as reactions or protections for businesses and consumers as they are new situations are brought to light um, and situations occur. Then certain areas of the government have taken steps to ensure the safety, such as the Sherman Act. So that was a reaction to situations that now continues to be implemented and affect us this many years later. We learn about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 and how the CEOs and CFOs must certify statements and reports as accurate under a penalty of imprisonment. And that is a reaction to situations that certainly CEOs and CFOs weren't doing that and weren't disclosing or signing off that things were kind of on the up and up, if you will. So situations like that have created these types of legislative responses to ensure that best they can that they don't happen again, or that there are penalties, whether they're civil or criminal penalties for not following the legislation. There are a number of other acts that we learn about, such as the Security Act. And again, these things are still affecting us today. These things that, the Security Act of 1933 is still the reactions and repercussions from that are still being implemented in today's world, in today's society. So a lot of these things talk about steps that need to be taken um, in order to be in compliance, or the reactions, what can be taken, what actions can be taken if things aren't going correctly. And so there are certain restrictions within particular situations and business dealings that people need to be aware of. There are certain times that information needs to be shared or disclosed ahead of time. These chapters also talk about the defenses that people can have or businesses can have, the remedies that people can take to rectify situations. It's also important to know that there are, if a business thinks that they're leaving the country or bringing their business elsewhere and they won't have these repercussions within the United States, um, that may be somewhat true, but there may be situations that they need to be aware of in other countries as well. So I think if you are a business that is dealing in foreign um, countries, foreign lands, that you, again, we learn that it's very critical that you be diligent in understanding what the requirements are within the area that you um, are holding your business dealings with. And there are countries that have agreements with the U.S. about how situations will be handled. And so knowing exactly, what those are and what those mean, it, for you as a business is extremely important. Chapter 24, really the focus turns to the antitrust. We learn a lot in this chapter about the antitrust laws and how they can be carried out in both the public and in the private sector. We learn about the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and how they are primarily responsible for enforcing the antitrust laws in the public sector, and then the jurisdiction that the Federal Trade Commission has as far as the Clayton Act and enforcements in that area. So again, we really learn a lot about what the Sherman Act is all about. And in some ways, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around some things within this chapter and how they could impact a small business. And maybe that's really more on the Clayton Act side of things. I found there to be, while there were some things that I could certainly grasp pretty easily, such as monopolies and, kind of what is a monopoly. And then when we talk about injury to competition and, how uh, those various lines and how that all kind of fits together, some of this information is really potentially confusing, a lot of it, and how exactly does that fit in kind of with the world that you are working in or plan to work in. Um, the the talk about mergers and acquisitions of various companies. Those are things, that we have heard in the news and have seen happen over, a course of time. And so maybe are somewhat familiar, but haven't really had that direct experience. So reading about the various steps that need to be taken in that kind of situation and how those things need to be handled. Um, the I thought that it was very interesting to learn that the Sherman Act has a transnational reach. So again, doing business outside of the U.S. does not preclude you from being needing to follow the guidelines that are set forth and the legislation that's set forth in the Sherman Act. The Clayton Act, however, does not have transnational reach. And so, kind of what does that mean and how then are those situations handled? I think some of the, again, information that we read about the, like part of our homework assignment with the NFL situation and, how how that is handled or could be handled knowing where the lines are and where the lines can be drawn, knowing that, as an individual who's working for a company under, say, a larger umbrella, like, you don't have that individual say, because what you're doing is falling under a larger um, umbrella, that kind of thing. And finally, the chapter winds down with talking about the Bank Merger Act and of 1966, and knowing that all bank mergers have to be approved by the banking agency that has jurisdiction in that particular area. Again, I found this to be a lot of like heavy reading, a lot of information really condensed into these two chapters. I think definitely the Sherman Act and probably the Clayton Act as well carry. You could probably do weeks worth of studying on those particular acts and how they fit in with the business today, and how businesses need to handle themselves to be sure that they're in compliance with those particular acts. So a lot of information packed into this, final push for the semester. Um, Again, this is, kind of out of my wheelhouse as far as, what my business um, has been up till now. But who knows where the future will lead and what information I might need going forward. So it's good information to know and to read. And again, I find it very interesting how in one class you're learning. This isn't the first time that I've read information about the Sherman Act, but here it is again, and now we're diving in deeper. So I do find that part of this information really fascinating, and to see how all those pieces of the puzzle fit together. So I'm looking forward to our final chapter and our final week of class.